Chief guest, Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi, former Honorable Union Minister of India. Guest of honor, the eminent Dr. Kapila Vatsyanan, Chairperson of the IIC's Asia Project. Honorable Sikyong of the Central Tibetan Administration, Dr. Lobsam Sangye. Expert participants of this one-day conference on the Simla Convention after 100 years. Representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Mr. Nepatsaring. Director of the Tibet Policy Institute, Mr. Thupten Sampel. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasant duty on behalf of the Tibet Policy Institute and the India International Center to welcome you to this conference. I'm also grateful to the organizers for affording me this opportunity to make a few welcome remarks, I'm told, although I assure you that I'll not take up more than a few moments of your time on this. The aim of this conference is to, and I quote, look into the future to suggest better relations between India and the People's Republic of China and a just and dignified treatment of Tibet by China. It was exactly 100 years ago today, on July 3rd, 1914, that the Simla Convention was signed, albeit in one case only initialed. Curiously, on June 28th, 1914, which is 5 days before the conclusion of the convention, an angry young man in Serbia assassinated the putative monarch of the Habsburg Empire and sparked what was to be known as World War I, or the war to end all wars. As it turns out, that act also set in motion what was to become a new world formation for the following century, as the old imperial arrangement started to break up and we saw the beginnings of a new one, the bipolar Cold War regime, as it was put in place. 25 years ago today, that bipolar concordat was once again shaken up as the gap between the world's economically deprived, politically disenfranchised, socially disadvantaged, and economically deprived peoples reacted. Meanwhile, a new political set of formations was taking place, a multipolar world in which spheres of influence, as Mulk Raj Anand told me a few months before his passing, was starting to hold sway. These orbs of persuasion, if you will, are arguably represented by the United States, China, India, Russia, and the pressures of consortia such as the European Union, ASEAN, Latin American Peninsula, and such other organizations as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. To me, this appears to be a return to the conditions that are not far different from what they were, well, 100 years ago. What does this mean for the world's smaller entities, such as Tibet, which we have gathered to discuss today? Entities that are not political powers, but offer their peoples, and indeed the world, ways of life and living that are just as unique and precious as those of civilizations that have become political powers. Will it mean forfeiting diversity for homogeneity, or sacrificing autonomy for hegemony, or indeed replacing social responsibility with private or corporate wealth? Will the larger entities recognize the lessons of history and nurture diversity, plurality, and autonomy, or will they foster artificial homogeneity and forced hegemony? These are important issues in China and elsewhere, where governments are being challenged with such questions by their diverse, plural, and autonomous populations. We have amongst us today eminent thinkers and expert researchers to offer their perspectives and findings on some of these questions. So let me not stand between you and them any longer so that the dialogue can begin. I'm sure you, as I look forward to hearing them. I conclude my remarks by once again welcoming all of you and respectfully requesting all the dignitaries on the dais to grace us by lighting the lamp. Thank you. And may I now ask, respectfully request Dr. Kapila Vatsyanan to grace us with the opening address. Thank you.
The chairperson of this morning's meeting, Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi, Dr. Wahid, former Vice Chancellor of a university of science and technology in a very historic place, Avantipur. And Avantipur stands as a symbol of learning. I, as someone connected with Kashmir, have gone through those from Avantipur to Martand, and the monasteries and the temples which are reminders of all the dialogues that we shall be speaking about. The newly elected political leader of the government in exile, I don't know how to introduce him, because my association with that exodus from Tibet, and especially when His Holiness came here, and that is how I am here, goes back to those historic days of the 50s, 54, 56, and in that human presence was the embodiment of not just political exile, but an embodiment of a culture, of a civilization, of values embodied in that human form and all that he represented. Our friend from Netherlands, Dr. Van Praag, has spent a lifetime studying the political relations and will speak to you. There are others here, whether it is Mr. Ravi, who has known that political area, or others who are going to be speaking about future, such as Mr. Madhav. All this, yes, to sign, not to commemorate. I don't think this is a commemoration of an agreement which in its very nature was, may I say, had some flaws. Whatever that agreement was on the 3rd of July, China never ratified it. And this is a fact that is on record. I'm not a political historian, but as I go through the history, my mind goes back not to 3rd July 1914, but goes back to the 19th century, to 1890, to this landmass which was attracting people. People means powers. This landmass which became, as our childhood memory and in our imagination, was the roof of the world. It was from where clouds came down with knowledge, perception, experience. It was a land which we had known in our childhood as beyond the snows. And I often asked my father, Pitaji, what is it this is beyond the snows? And beyond the snows lies this land of wisdom, of experience. And at a political level, what was happening there? Whether it was Great Britain or Russia, and we know that story, and China, hesitant and yet aggressive. The details of this make not fascinating reading, but the details of this also tell us of the painful history of acquisition. Let's not forget, as Indians, what happened when Lord Curzon sent those armies in 1904 and the massacres that took place. Let's not forget why the 13th Dalai Lama had to leave. Let's not forget that there was, in terms of purely the landmass, the distinction between outer Tibet and inner Tibet. We must not just restrict ourselves to this Simla agreement and its clauses at the political level, important as it is, and we are marking that 100 years. But in these 100 years, there have been other changes, and each of these changes really impels us to speak about the balance of political power in relation to those land masses which hold wisdom, which have been the sites of knowledge, which have been outside any relationships at the political which we know in European history, or for that matter in Indian history. And why does it attract everybody? And yet, this isolation is not an isolation, it is a universe. For me, today, when we speak about this Simla agreement, no doubt all of you, or most of you who are going to be speaking here, will speak on the politico-historical relationships. But for us, at another level, it is the wisdom tradition of India, the wisdom tradition of Asia, the wisdom tradition of a Nagarjuna, the wisdom and the experience tradition which transforms the human to be beyond the human. And that is what His Holiness represents when he speaks about compassion, when he speaks about karuna. And it is that living tradition at its most vital in experience, which, whatever that outer Tibet was, its monasteries, its learning traditions, and why did people travel from one part of India to that other part of India? And I go back to Kashmir. Why did the third and the fourth assembly take place in Harvan? We have to ask these questions because they are related directly to what we today call the Tibetan wisdom tradition, which is spread all over. His Holiness, with great affection, calls me mother. I have been associated these decades, I have laughed with him. I said, you know, Western Europe would not have known a knowledge tradition but for the fall of Constantinople. And that is how wisdom came and knowledge came. So, Your Holiness, whatever happened, and we know that, and I'm part of the witness or even participant since the 50s. But look, Tibet is all over the world. In the centers of science and technology, in neurobiology, and not to speak about philosophy. And in that, as we sat downstairs, our chairman very rightly alluded to that knowledge which from Nalanda was transmitted to different centers, be it China or Tibet, and the restoration of that knowledge in terms of the institutional base in India has been an effort. Again, I as the human instrument, and Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi mentioned the Sarnath Institute. One day, sir, I shall write that story as to how that institute and the other institutes were an effort by India to reconstruct, to bring back those thousands and thousands of manuscripts which are in the collections still of the monasteries, and not to speak about China, Mongolia, and other places. If the world has to see peace, the world has to see the sources of the great traditions of these cultures which have committed themselves to peace outside border issues and beyond land into the land of the heart. Thank you very much.
May I now ask the Honorable Dr. Lobsang Sangye Sekyong of the Central Tibetan Administration to give his keynote address.
Honorable Chief Guest, Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi ji, Guest of Honor, Dr. Kapila Vatsayan, thank you very much for giving a very personal and passionate account of history and your friendship with Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And also I would like to thank Professor Siddiq Wahid for chairing this panel, and my friend Dr. Michael Van Walt for coming all the way to participate in this conference, and hopefully Dr. Madhav will also come shortly and address the conference. Today we mark the centennial of the Simla Convention. In this intervening century, much has changed and progressed in the world, but the issue of Tibet has not seen progress as such. In this century, in the last century, World War I and World War II was fought, and it brought an end to colonialism. India became independent, China became People's Republic, but Tibet was independent. Tibet was invaded and occupied and still remain under occupation. Berlin Wall collapsed, Soviet Union imploded, Cold War came to an end, and along with it, the third wave of democracy swept the world. color revolution in Eastern European countries, and recently Arab Spring in Arab countries. But democracy is yet to touch the shore of China, the largest populated country in the world. And also in this century, actually, among the Nobel Peace Laureates, many experience positive changes and successes. Nobel Peace Laureate Nelson Mandela, after spending 27 years in prison, went on to become the president of South Africa, where democracy was revived and equality was introduced. Similarly, Nobel Peace Laureate Ramos Horta, whom I've met, after many years in exile, returned to independent East Timor. Nobel laureate Betty Williams also saw the day of Good Friday Agreement, and peace prevailed in Northern Ireland. And also even Aung San Suu Kyi, who after many years of house arrest was released and traveled around the world, and is trying her best to revive democracy in Burma. Yet one Nobel Peace Laureate, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is still in exile and yet to return to his rightful place in Tibet, which is the aspiration of 6 million Tibetans and their friends around the world. Since 1959, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama arrived in India via Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh, there has been no shortage of studies on Tibet, as scholars have analyzed the question from all disciplines, legally, politically, environmentally, and historically. Today we have the chief guest, Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi, who was sharing us a story, in fact, of Tibetans coming to his backyard or the front door in 50s and 40s. And during those days, the Indian pilgrims who used to go to Mansarovar or Kailash used to pass through Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi's front door. See, he told me of testing even Tibetan tea, but he didn't exactly say whether he liked it or not. But he said it was more like salt in lassi. But nonetheless, he witnessed Tibet being free and Tibetans passing through the area. And similarly, Ram Madhav, who might join us later, who has written a book called Uneasy Neighbors on India, China, and on the issue of Tibet. And Michael Van Walt, he will be looking at the Tibet issue from international, maybe international legal perspective. So we have different disciplines, different experts coming to this conference and sharing their views, for which we are very, very grateful. Today, I will try to address on two issues actually. What lessons can be learned from history of Tibet, and what is the way forward for Tibet? Since we have gathered here to mark the 100th anniversary of the Simla Convention, I want to remind the audience that Tibet and China had coexisted geographically since time immemorial. And also, it's a fact, as Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi is a witness, that it was always India and China which shared the border. It was never China and India. I'm sorry, it was always Tibet and India which shared the border, and never China and India. So all these issues we'll discuss today. Also, there are historical documents predating 1914 Simla Convention and after. These documents range from the 821-822 Sino-Tibet Treaty to the 17-point agreement in 1951. A cursory glance at the 821 treaty reveals that Tibet and China were two sovereigns. As the treaty declares, all to the east is the country of Great China, and all to the west is the country of Great Tibet. The 17-point agreement brought Tibet under the direct control of Beijing, albeit under duress, and in between lies the whole complex mosaic of Sino-Tibet relations. In the 13th century, Tibet stood at the junction of competing empires as Imperial China competed with the Mongol Empire. The priest-patron relations came into existence, initiated by the Mongols, but later adopted by Manchu China. This mutually expedient relationship broke down when Great Britain overran India and intruded into Tibet. In the early 20th century, in the great game between the Russian and the British empires, Tibet became a strategic geopolitical prize. And this competition from Tibet rattled the traditional Sino-Tibet relations. In response to the 1904 young husband's military expedition to Tibet, the Qing dynasty in its last years embarked on an integrationist policy to bring Tibet under the direct control of Tungo, or the Middle Kingdom. Therefore, the Simla Convention was an effort of the government of Tibet and British India to determine the status of Tibet. Scholars now conclude that after the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911, Tibet enjoyed effective independence. British India convened the Simla Convention 1914 to secure China's recognition of and respect for autonomy for Tibet, and to create Tibet as a buffer to prevent any hostile big powers from hurting British interests in India. British India was able to convene the Simla Convention between representatives of independent Tibet, Republican China, and British India because of China's need for international diplomatic recognition for Yuan Shikhai's new government in Beijing. On October 7, 1913, Yuan Shikhai recognized Tibetan autonomy, and on the same day, according to Jonathan Spence, Britain extended its diplomatic recognition to the new Chinese Republic. With these diplomatic activities in the background, the Simla Convention was held from 13 October 1913 to July 3, 1914. The Tibetan plenipotentiary Longchen Shatra came to the convention armed with hundreds of documents to say that Tibet consisted of three traditional provinces of Central, Eastern, and Northeastern Tibet, or Yuzhangkham and Amdo, roughly corresponding to the Tibetan Plateau. While defining the boundary between Tibet and China, the Simla Convention also demarcated the border between British India and Tibet, which came to be known as McMahon Line. The Chinese representative or plenipotentiary, Evan Chen, initialed the document but did not ratify the convention. His objection was not on the demarcation of boundary between Tibet and India, but with the boundary between Tibet and China. On July 3, 1914, the result of the convention was signed as a bilateral agreement between British India and sovereign Tibet. As an offshoot of the Simla Convention, a trade pact was signed on the sideline, which was to be renewed every 10 years, then from 1904 to 14 to 24 to 34, 44, every 10 years the trade pact was renewed. In 1954, it was called the Panchshil Agreement between India and China. At that time, India wanted the agreement to last for 25 years, but China wanted it to last for 5 years. finally they agreed for 8 years. Interestingly, after the expiration of the 8 years period, in April 1962, war broke between India and China 6 months later. Of the Simla Convention signed 100 years ago, I would like to make 2 clarifications. The first clarification concerns the legality of the Megmon Line. I would like to emphasize that the demarcation of the border between Tibet and India was done between 2 sovereign political entities. A sovereign Tibet legally ceded a part of its territory to British India. The second point I would like to make is that when Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China on 1st October 1949 from the podium in Tiananmen Square, Tibet was not part of PRC. Only a year later, in October 1950, when the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet, and in 1951, when the 17-point agreement was forced on Tibetans, did Tibet come under the direct control of the PRC. The weakness of both the Simla 17-point agreement and the Simla agreement was that it divided one people sharing a common language, culture, and religion and way of life into 2. In addition to the protest against the invasion and occupation of Tibet, the division of Tibet into 2 was one of the major causes of armed resistance which sparked in eastern and northeastern Tibet, which eventually engulfed the whole of Tibet and culminated in the Lhasa uprising in 1959. These events in turn forced His Holiness the Dalai Lama and thousands of Tibetans to seek refuge, mainly in India. Even today, Tibetans living across the Tibetan plateau perceive themselves as a single nationality and hold in common a deep resentment against Chinese repression. This resentment culminated in the 2008 uprising that erupted in 100 different counties across Tibet. Similarly, Tibetan as a single nationality sharing the same deep resentment has been demonstrated by 130 Tibetan self-immolations across Tibet, mainly in Amdo and Kham, of which, sadly, 112 have died. Over the past 5 decades, there has been ongoing political repression in Tibet, social discrimination, economic marginalization, environmental destruction, and cultural assimilation, particularly due to the Chinese migration to Tibet, which fuels intense resentment among the Tibetan people. Against this backdrop, and in the hope of the future reconciliation, His Holiness the Dalai Lama proposed the middle way policy as a win-win solution for both the sides to reflect on old relations and look forward to the future. The middle way policy is not only for the Tibetan people, but also for Asia as well, because Tibet is of critical importance for all of Asia, particularly India, environmentally and geopolitically. First, let me address the environmental significance of Tibet to the rest of Asia, which Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi will also do so. These days, scientists refer to Tibet as the third pole, the repository of the largest concentration of ice and glaciers outside the Arctic, concentration of ice and glaciers outside of the Arctic and Antarctica is the largest. These glaciers feed the 10 river system in Asia, including Indus River, Satluj River, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, and Mekong, which flows all the way to Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand, Yellow and Yangtze River, which flow to China, all originating in Tibet and bringing fresh water for more than 1 billion people in China, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. Clearly, what happens to Tibet is not a problem of the Tibetan people alone. Tibet's fate will affect the existence of millions of people downstream whose livelihoods are dependent on agriculture and fishing. Scientists also predict that the global climate change impact on the Tibetan plateau will lead to millions of forced migration in the downstream countries. On this score, I feel that it is in the self-interest of all Asia to persuade the leadership in Beijing to allow the people of Tibet to be restored the traditional guardianship of the Tibetan plateau, which they have maintained for thousands of years. Secondly, Tibet also holds significant reserve of more than 130 different types of minerals, worth trillions of dollars, from uranium, gold, copper, borax, and even petrol, are exploited by the Chinese company without due consideration to the local environment and the people. Similarly, Tibet's pristine forests are cut down, causing landslides, silting of rivers, and flooding downstream neighboring countries. Thirdly, Tibet is geopolitically important because it is the heart of Asia. Geopolitical expert John McLaughlin recently wrote how 2014 is strikingly similar to 1914, when Europe stood on the brink of the First World War. Of course, a violent conflict is in nobody's best interest. However, today the Tibetan plateau is becoming highly militarized, and many experts conclude that the fastest arms race is in Asia. On top of this, the lack of proper demarcation of borders prompt frequent incursions. The Chinese map showing many areas of neighboring countries as part of China, and understandably, this creates nervousness in Asia as a whole. By resolving the Tibet issue, Beijing will send a positive message in the region, and I strongly believe that India, Europe, and United States will begin to view China as a responsible power. Tibetan people welcome any improvement in relations between India and our neighbors, including China. It is the hope of the Central Tibet administration that improved relations between the two countries will lead to China reopening the Indian consulate in Lhasa. A friendly neighbor's diplomatic presence in the capital city of Tibet will bolster the Tibetan people's confidence in the benign intention of Beijing. Then the true spirit of the Panchshil agreement will be revived. So what is the way forward given this backdrop of historical, environmental, and geopolitical complexity? It is my conviction there is a viable and effective solution to the issue of Tibet, and I already shared. This is the middle way approach, envisioned by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, already supported by international leaders, including the US President Barack Obama, and many Chinese intellectuals, such as the Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobao. The middle way refers to the middle way between repression of Tibetans and separation from China. In 2008, the Memorandum of Genuine Autonomy for the Tibetan Plateau was presented by the envoys of the Dalai Lama to the Chinese authorities. The document says, I quote, "The essence of the middle way approach is to secure genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people within the framework of the Chinese constitution. This is of mutual benefit and based on long-term interests of both the Tibetan and Chinese people. The protection and development of the unique Tibetan identity in all its aspects serves the larger interests of humanity in general and those of the Tibetan and Chinese people in particular," unquote. There is growing support among scholars in mainland China for the middle way approach through petitions, open letters to the Chinese authorities, and numerous articles. They urge the Chinese leadership to embrace this approach. I am confident that over time, these Chinese voices expressing their support for the Tibetan peace overtures will grow louder. The willingness to resolve the Tibet issue and the ability of the new Chinese leaders, led by President Xi Jinping, will lay a strong foundation for President's vision for China as expressed in his China Dream. For the Tibetans to share in the China Dream, they must be treated with respect and allowed to enhance and promote their respective national and cultural identities. If this is done, President Xi Jinping's China Dream will have real meaning and appeal. So finally, I'm here to thank once again the participants, and particularly I take this opportunity to express our deepest gratitude to the government and people of India for hosting His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Tibetan community for this many years. India has done the most for Tibetan people, and for that, the Tibetans are forever indebted. I would like to conclude by saying that 100 years ago, when British India made efforts to address the issue of Tibet, the Simla Agreement, however, this attempt failed. In 1951, China forced the 17-point agreement on Tibetan people, but they did not implement the spirit, both the spirit and letter of the agreement, and also failed. Then Panchshil Agreement of 1954 was also an attempt to address the issue of Tibet and establish Hindi-China bye-bye, but that also failed. Now what we need is a Tibetan-initiated solution supported by great powers and neighboring countries. Making this agreement work is in China's own primary interests as a rising superpower and interests of Asia as a whole. Finally, the 14th Kashak, or the Tibetan administration, dedicates 2014 to His Holiness the Great 14th Dalai Lama. We are also aware that in 2014, Sri Narendra Modi taking over leadership of a shining India. So I hope that 2014 will not be remembered as the 100th anniversary of the First World War or the year when Simla Convention was ratified between British India and Tibet, but rather it be remembered as a catalyst year for a peaceful 21st century as envisioned by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We fervently hope that such an outbreak of peace in Asia will realize the dream of millions of Tibetans who long for freedom, and like other Nobel Peace Laureates, the return of His Holiness Dalai Lama to his rightful place in Tibet. If we succeed, it will not be the success of 6 million Tibetans alone. It will be a success of ahimsa, freedom and justice. It will be a success of an ancient civilization, revived and preserved. The story of Tibet will be one of the best stories of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lobsang. May I now respectfully request Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi to give his presidential address. Ji, please.
Dr. Lobsang Sangye, Adharaniya Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan ji, Mr. Michael Von और प्रोफेसर सिद्दीक वाहिद, आज के इस बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण सम्मेलन में पधारे हुए आप सभी विश्व शांति के लिए समर्पित और विशेषकर एशिया में शांति के लिए समर्पित आए हुए प्रतिनिधि, विद्वान और आमंत्रित महानुभाव, जब मुझे डॉक्टर सांगे का पत्र इस सम्मेलन में आने के लिए मिला तो मैं दुविधा में था कि मैं पहुंच पाऊंगा या नहीं पहुंच पाऊंगा। लेकिन ये संभव हो सका कि मैं आज आपके पास यहाँ उपस्थित हूँ। मेरा विचार है कि हिंदी आप सब लोग समझते हैं। जहाँ कहीं आवश्यकता होगी किसी बहुत ही ऐसे प्रसंग की जिसमें अंग्रेज़ी का उपयोग करना ज़रूरी होगा, वहाँ मैं कर दूँगा। मैं अल्मोड़ा ज़िले का निवासी हूँ मूलतः, और उस समय अल्मोड़ा बड़ा ज़िला था। आज की तरह पिथौरागढ़ अलग और बागेश्वर अलग और चंपावत अलग ऐसा नहीं था, बहुत बड़ा जनपद था। और कैलाश मानसरोवर की यात्रा के लिए लोग जो जाते थे वो उसी मार्ग से जाते थे जिस पर मेरा घर था। आज उसे महात्मा गांधी मार्ग कहते हैं, उस ज़माने में उसे मॉल रोड कहा जाता था। उस पर तिब्बत से आने वाले भाई बहन अपना व्यापार करते थे और लोग अक्टूबर के महीने से इस बार इंतज़ार में रहते थे कि ये लोग कब आएँ और तिब्बत की कला वस्तुएं, जड़ी बूटियाँ, ख़ास तौर पर शिलाजीत जो शुद्ध वहाँ से आती थी, सूर्यतापी, आजकल मिलती नहीं, उसकी तलाश में बहुत से चिकित्सक आते थे, आयुर्वेदिक दवाई बनाने वाले लोग आते थे कि इस बाज़ार से ये जड़ी बूटियाँ और दवाइयाँ ली जाएं। कला प्रेमी लोग आते थे जो तिब्बती कला और विशेषकर जो ऊनी कालीन होते थे उनको ख़रीदने के लिए आते थे। इसका प्रभाव ये भी था कि उत्तराखंड के उन ज़िलों में जो कालीन की बुनावट थी वो आज भी तिब्बती पैटर्न के ऊपर ही होती है, आज भी होती है। और इसका एक परिणाम ये भी था कि जो बिल्कुल हमारे सीमा के आसपास के गांव थे उनके मकानों की रचना भी उसी तौर तरीके से, उसी पैटर्न पर होती थी। तो एक बहुत ज़बरदस्त भाईचारा तिब्बत में और भारत के उस क्षेत्र में तो था ही, और कैलाश मानसरोवर में क्योंकि यात्रा में सारे भारत के लोग जाते थे तो एक तरह से तिब्बत भारत की मैत्री का वो एक संगम स्थल था। इसलिए बहुत से तिब्बती उस समय व्यापारी वर्षानुवर्ष आते थे। इस बार आए तो अगले साल भी आए, अगले साल भी आए, और उनके बैठने की जगह भी लगभग निश्चित ही हो जाती थी कि यहाँ ये आएंगे और यही बैठेंगे, उनकी पहचान भी होती थी। तो कई लोगों से एक ऐसा संबंध हो गया था, हम तो छोटे थे लेकिन उनके यहाँ से कुछ कलाकृति खरीदनी है, कुछ बीड्स खरीदनी है या कोई ऐसी चीज़ें खरीदनी है तो मालूम था कि यहाँ आएंगे, इनसे यहाँ खरीदनी। तो ये बहुत पुराना संबंध 40 के दशक में उनके साथ था। उसके बाद 1977 में मैं अल्मोड़े से संसद का सदस्य था। तब भी जो हमारी सीमा थी, जिसे आज आप पिथौरागढ़ ज़िला कहते हैं, उसका जो धारचूला केंद्र है वो आज भी तिब्बत, भारत और नेपाल के व्यापार का केंद्र बना हुआ है। यद्यपि अब वो व्यापार उतना सरल और ट्रांसपेरेंट नहीं है, पारदर्शी नहीं है। उस व्यापार में थोड़ी सी अनैतिकता भी है, लेकिन है क्योंकि वो व्यापार करना है, लोगों को जीविका चलानी है। तो उस समय जैसे ही मेरी लोकसभा की, संसद की सीमा समाप्त होती थी, उसके आगे एक तरफ नेपाल और दूसरी तरफ तिब्बत शुरू होता। थोड़ा सा फूलों की घाटी से निकलिए गुंजी वैली से और आप तिब्बत में। तो तिब्बत के साथ इस प्रकार का एक थोड़ा सा, जैसे आप भावात्मक संबंध कहेंगे, इमोशनल अटैचमेंट कहेंगे, वो इस नाते से भी था कि बचपने से देखते आ रहे हैं कि तिब्बत और हम कोई एक दूसरे से भिन्न नहीं है, हम एक ही सिस्टम के पार्ट हैं। पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम अलग होगा, लेकिन एक भावात्मक संबंध, इमोशनल संबंध, व्यापार का संबंध, सांस्कृतिक संबंध, ये बराबर बना हुआ था। और उसी में जैसा मैं बता रहा था कि तिब्बत के भोजन और तिब्बत की कुछ चीज़ों को चखने का भी मौका मिला, जिसमें से तिब्बती चाय थी। अब उसे चाय कहा जाए या नमकीन लस्सी कहा जाए, ये एक शब्द आप अपने हिसाब से प्रयोग कर सकते हैं। मुझे पता नहीं आप में से किसी ने तिब्बती चाय का कभी रसास्वादन किया है या नहीं। वो स्वाद आपको लगे या न लगे, लेकिन बड़ी पौष्टिक होती है, क्योंकि उसमें काफ़ी मात्रा में मक्खन और जड़ी बूटियाँ होती हैं। तो इसलिए वो तिब्बत की जलवायु के हिसाब से, फॉर क्लाइमेटिक रीजन्स, वो एक बहुत बढ़िया पेय है। इट इज़ अ वेरी गुड ड्रिंक। पता नहीं आपने उसे भारत में अभी लोकप्रिय बनाया है या नहीं बनाया है, और ये भी मुझे पता नहीं कि धर्मशाला में उसका उपयोग होता है या नहीं होता है, लेकिन कम से कम वो एक क्यूज़ाइन डाइवर्सिटी फिर से इस देश में कहीं ना कहीं उसका भी उपयोग हो सकता है इस नाते से। खैर, लेकिन जहाँ एक तिब्बत के साथ ऐसा संबंध भी रहा, वहाँ कुछ बातें सीमांत पर ये सुनने को आती थी कि यहाँ चीन के लोग भी आए। सन 62 के पहले भी आए, क्योंकि अल्मोड़ा ज़िले की सीमा तिब्बत से लगती थी, और चीनी जब तिब्बत में आए तो उनमें से कुछ लोग वहाँ की सीमा तक भी आए। 62 में तो आए ही। तो इसलिए भी ये समझ में आया कि ये क्या हो रहा है, ऐसा क्यों हो रहा है, ये परिस्थिति कैसे आ गई, ये कहाँ से बात चली थी और कहाँ पहुँच गई। ये सोचने का मौका तब देश भर के सामने भी आया, और हमारे जैसे लोगों के सामने जो जुड़े हुए हैं सीमा से, तिब्बत के साथ हज़ारों सालों से, उनके सामने भी आया। तिब्बत और भारत के संबंध सांस्कृतिक भी हैं, आध्यात्मिक भी हैं, ऐतिहासिक भी हैं, व्यापारिक भी हैं। अभी नागार्जुन का उल्लेख हुआ। अगर नागार्जुन दर्शन शास्त्र को, उसकी गहराइयों को और उसकी विविधताओं को, उसकी व्याख्याओं को जानना हो, तो आज भी आपको तिब्बत या मंगोलिया में ही जाना पड़ेगा। तो एक भारतवासी के नाते ये तो हमारा सामान्य कर्तव्य बन जाता है, सामान्य हमारा धर्म बन जाता है कि हम उस पुराने अपने खजाने को, उस साहित्य के और संस्कृति के कोश को, उसका संरक्षण करें, उसको नष्ट होने से बचाएं। क्योंकि ये तो हमें ध्यान रखना चाहिए कि भारत का जो सांस्कृतिक अवदान है, जो कल्चरल कंट्रीब्यूशन है उस क्षेत्र में, जो आध्यात्मिक कंट्रीब्यूशन है उस क्षेत्र में, और वहीं से चीन को गया, वहीं से और आसपास के देशों को गया, इस बात को ध्यान में रखना चाहिए कि तिब्बत ने ही चीन को सुसंस्कृत बनाया। ख़ास तौर पर जितने भी महत्वपूर्ण बुद्ध धर्म के सिद्धांत हैं, वो सब तिब्बत से चीन में गए। एक संपर्क चीन से समुद्र मार्ग से भी था, लेकिन जो गहरा संबंध रहा वो आप देखेंगे कि वो तिब्बत से चीन में गया है, तिब्बत से मंगोलिया में गया है। और तिब्बत का ये महत्व हमें हमेशा ध्यान में रखना चाहिए कि वो जैसे विश्व की छत है, ये एशिया की नहीं, विश्व की छत है, उतना बड़ा पठार कहीं नहीं है। तो वहाँ से भी कुछ सांस्कृतिक और आध्यात्मिक तत्व, दार्शनिक तत्व ये दुनिया में जाते हैं, गए। छत पर बैठा हुआ व्यक्ति दूर तक देखता है, तो तिब्बती दृष्टि इस मामले में दूर तक देखने की रही, और इसीलिए वो एक शांति का क्षेत्र बना रहा। लड़ाइयाँ भी होती रहीं, सारी कुछ होती रहीं, लेकिन ऐसा नहीं था कि कोई सांस्कृतिक विनाश का या किसी जातीय विनाश का दृश्य उस क्षेत्र में देखा गया हो। उस समय की जिस 1914 की हम बात कर रहे हैं, उस समय तिब्बत के बारे में जो ब्रिटिश नीति थी वो कोई किसी विश्व शांति की दृष्टि से नहीं थी। 1914 में यूरोप स्वयं एक बारूद पर बैठा हुआ था, बारूद के ढेर पर बैठा हुआ था। रूस की शक्ति से यूरोप के बहुत से देश डर रहे थे। ब्रिटेन को एशिया में और मध्य एशिया में अपना शक्ति संतुलन बनाए रखने के लिए तिब्बत का महत्व समझ में आता था। आखिर छत पर बैठा हुआ व्यक्ति दूर दूर तक देख सकता है। तो जो जियो पॉलिटिकल और जियो स्ट्रेटेजिकल पोजीशन थी तिब्बत की, उसकी ब्रिटेन को बहुत आवश्यकता थी। चीन पर भी दृष्टि रख सकता था, सारे मध्य एशिया पर दृष्टि रख सकता था, और रूस को पर भी निगाह रख सकता था। अफ़गानिस्तान और दूर दूर तक वहाँ से निगाह जाती है। तो इसलिए ये जो अभी जिस ग्रेट गेम का आप जिक्र कर रहे थे, वो ग्रेट गेम तिब्बत पर एक प्रकार का वर्चस्व, और अगर वर्चस्व न हो तो कम से कम वो चीन और रूस के पास न जाए, ये ब्रिटेन की नीति उस समय संभावित थी, जैसा मेरा अनुमान है। इसलिए उन्होंने रूस और के साथ भी तिब्बत को लेके संधि की थी, इफ आई एम करेक्ट। चीन के साथ भी वो करना चाहते थे, और ये चाहते थे कि किसी तरह से तिब्बत अपने आप में अपनी स्वाधीनता को बनाए रखे और चीन से भी दूर रहे, रूस से भी दूर रहे, और ब्रिटिश भारत के बिल्कुल नज़दीक रहे, तो ब्रिटेन के भी हितों का साधन होता था। अब ये 1914 की जो विश्व की स्थिति थी, वो अब 2014 की विश्व की स्थिति नहीं है। तो 100 सालों में तिब्बत में क्या हुआ, इसको समझने के लिए इन 100 सालों में दुनिया में क्या हो गया, इसकी तरफ भी ध्यान देने की ज़रूरत है। और ये जो आपका इंस्टीट्यूट है पॉलिसी स्टडीज़ का, इससे मेरा अनुरोध होगा कि ज़रा इसको भी देखें कि 100 साल में जैसे जैसे अंतर्राष्ट्रीय राजनीति में परिवर्तन आते चले गए, वैसे वैसे तिब्बत के साथ क्या क्या कुछ होता चला गया। तिब्बत में जो कुछ हुआ वो निंदनीय है। कोई सभ्य समाज इस बात को का समर्थन नहीं कर सकता कि एक इथनिक क्लींसिंग की जाए, एक जातीय पूरे तौर पर एक जाति को, एक संस्कृति को, एक दर्शन को पूरे तौर पर नष्ट किया जाए। इसका समर्थन 21वीं शताब्दी का कोई समाज, कोई राष्ट्र नहीं कर सकता। तिब्बत के लोगों को अपना जीवन अपने अनुसार चलाने की जो मानवाधिकार के अंतर्गत प्राप्त स्वतंत्रता है, उसके समर्थन में मैं समझता हूँ हमें अंतर्राष्ट्रीय आत्मा को झकझोरने की ज़रूरत है। द इंटरनेशनल कॉन्शियंस मस्ट बी अराउज्ड कि आप किसी एक क्षेत्र से एक शांतिप्रिय नागरिकों के देश के शांतिप्रिय लोगों को आप इस तरह से हटाकर हिंसा के मार्ग से उनको नष्ट करके वहाँ आप डेमोग्राफिक चेंज कर दें, ये तो मैं समझता हूँ एक सभ्य विश्व के लिए, सुसंस्कृत विश्व के लिए किसी भी हालत में सही नहीं होना चाहिए। इट कैन नॉट बी एक्सेप्टेड। इसको हम कैसे स्वीकार कर सकते हैं? अगर एक तरफ अंतर्राष्ट्रीय संस्थाएं विविधता की प्रशंसा में और उसके समर्थन में और उसके संरक्षण में प्रस्ताव पास करती हैं, और मैं मानता हूं कि डाइवर्सिटी, विविधता, ये प्रकृति का जीवन है। तो आप उस विविधता को नष्ट करने वाले जितने भी बल हैं, जितनी भी शक्तियां हैं, उनसे ये तो कहें ही कि ये आप क्या कर रहे हैं, आप इस विविधता को क्यों नष्ट कर रहे हैं। सांस्कृतिक विविधता, दार्शनिक विविधता, एक स्वायत्त शासन की विविधता, एक आध्यात्मिक दृष्टि से पुष्पित होने वाली एक सभ्यता की एक विविधता, इसको आप क्यों नष्ट कर रहे हैं। क्या दुनिया में केवल शासन की वही पद्धतियां रहेंगी जो हम या कोई और देश रखता है, किसी नई पद्धति के रहने का कोई अधिकार नहीं है। ये सवाल है जो आज की इस 100 साल में जो तिब्बत में हुआ है उसमें से उठ रहे हैं। क्या 100 साल में मानव समाज इस तरफ बढ़ रहा है कि हम शांति और सद्भावना के साथ रहने वाले जनसमूह को, समाज को हटाकर उसके स्थान पर एक हिंसक समाज को स्थापित करें। क्या 100 साल में हम मानव प्रगति की इस दिशा को स्वीकार कर सकते हैं? मैं तो नहीं समझता कि कोई सभ्य समाज, कोई सुसंस्कृत समाज, कोई अपने को प्रगतिशील कहने वाला समाज इस स्थिति को स्वीकार करेगा कि अहिंसा को हटा के हिंसा ले आए, शांति को ले आके अशांति ले आए और सद्भावनाओं को हटा के युद्ध ले आए। ये कौन सी प्रगति है? तो 100 सालों में केवल तिब्बत में जो हो रहा है उसने सारे विश्व के सामने सवाल खड़े कर दिए हैं। और ये अगर आप तिब्बत के परिप्रेक्ष्य में इन सवालों को हल करें तो शायद अन्य स्थानों पर भी आप उसे हल कर सकते हैं। सांगे जी ने एनवायरमेंटल सवाल उठाया, मैं इसको बहुत दिनों से उठा रहा हूँ। दुनिया में केवल 2 ही पर्यावरणीय तंत्र हैं, एक अमेज़न में और एक हिमालय में। हिमालय, तिब्बत के साथ हिमालय का तंत्र बनता है, इकोसिस्टम। और ये इकोसिस्टम भारत और हिमालय के आसपास के जितने भी देश हैं उन सब के लिए बहुत आवश्यक है। चीन के लिए भी उतना ही आवश्यक है जितना म्यांमार के लिए आवश्यक है, या जितना मंगोलिया के लिए आवश्यक है, या जितना मध्य एशिया के और देशों के लिए आवश्यक है, और भारत के लिए तो परम आवश्यक है। ये अगर पर्यावरणीय तंत्र समाप्त हो गया तो भारत के लिए भारी संकट आएंगे। हमारे सारे जल स्रोत वहीं से आते हैं और उसके कारण से पाकिस्तान को भी संकट आएंगे, क्योंकि हमारे वही जल स्रोत पाकिस्तान को जाते हैं। सिंधु नदी का 80% पानी पाकिस्तान को जाता है। सिंधु नदी भारत से होते हुए पाकिस्तान को जाती है और सिंधु नदी हिमालय से निकलती है। ब्रह्मपुत्र, और अब तो ये भी सिद्ध हो गया है कि गंगा का पानी भी मानसरोवर के पानी में से ही आ रहा है। इरावदी उसी से होती है, चीन की नदी भी उसी से होंगी। और आप देख रहे हैं कि इसीलिए आप ब्रह्मपुत्र का थोड़ा सा डाइवर्शन करने की कोशिश हो रही है, क्योंकि जल का संकट चारों तरफ गहरा रहा है। अगर ये पर्यावरण आपने नष्ट कर दिया, आप अपना राजनीतिक और वर्चस्व भूल जाइए एक बार, लेकिन अपने अस्तित्व के लिए तो बात करिए। आप रहे चीन का अस्तित्व या वर्चस्व या तिब्बत का वर्चस्व, तिब्बत स्वयं स्वाधीन रहे या चीन उसके ऊपर कब्जा करे, लेकिन पर्यावरण तंत्र पर क्या करोगे? वो राजनीतिक अधिकार से परे है। इट इज़ बियॉन्ड पॉलिटिकल अथॉरिटी, इट इज़ बियॉन्ड पॉलिटिकल कंट्रोल। वो तो प्राकृतिक है। और अगर वहाँ गड़बड़ी शुरू हो गई जैसी कि हो रही हैं, तो ये उत्तराखंड की त्रासदी, ये उसी पर्यावरण के डिस्टर्बेंस का नतीजा है। चीन की नदियों का सूखना उसी का नतीजा है। तो अगर आप इकोसिस्टम के तौर पर ही कम से कम इसका संरक्षण करें भाई, क्या इसे एक अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर संरक्षित इकोसिस्टम के तौर पर विकसित नहीं किया जा सकता? कितना बड़ा इकोसिस्टम है, 2.5-3 बिलियन लोगों को तो चीन और भारत को सीधे ही प्रभावित करता है। तो इस नाते भी अगर आप देखें तो इसका बहुत महत्व है। और इसको जो लोग इस पर केवल स्ट्रेटेजिकली अधिकार करना चाहते हैं, मैं सबसे यही कहूँगा कि ये तो बहुत दूर की बात है, इससे कुछ बनने वाला नहीं है। पहले आप अपने अस्तित्व की रक्षा तो करिए, बाद में देखेंगे क्या होता है क्या नहीं होता है। पानी से ही बिजली पैदा होती है, पानी से ही अनाज पैदा होता है। और ये पानी का सारा सिस्टम इसी पर्यावरणीय तंत्र से हमको मिलता है। तो ये बहुत महत्व की चीज़ है। और मैं ये चाहूँगा कि सारे हिमालयवर्ती राज्य जितने भी हैं वो मिल के इस बात के लिए प्रयत्नशील हों कि तिब्बत और हिमालय का जो पर्यावरण है उसको हम बचाएं। ये अंतर्राष्ट्रीय दायित्व है, भारत का राष्ट्रीय दायित्व है। इन सारे हिमालयी राज्यों को मिलाकर क्या हम ऐसा तंत्र नहीं बना सकते? और इसलिए जब मैं सुन रहा था आपकी बात कि इसको शांति का क्षेत्र बनाने के लिए परम पूज्य दलाई लामा जी ने बार बार कहा है, ये एक महत्वपूर्ण सुझाव है। ये हमारे भारत की परंपरा से मिलता है, तिब्बत की परंपरा से मिलता है, और विश्व शांति के जो लोग पैरोकार हैं उन सब की परंपरा से मिलता है। तो ये हर दृष्टि से, प्राकृतिक शांति की दृष्टि से, पीस इन नेचर, पीस थ्रू नेचर्स कोलैबोरेशन एंड कोऑपरेशन, प्रकृति के साथ हमारा सामंजस्य हो, उसके साथ हमारा, ये बहुत महत्वपूर्ण से चीज़ें हैं जो उठ रही हैं। अब केवल इस पर सवाल नहीं है कि ये कितना है, क्या है। फिर इसके साथ साथ हम ये भी देखें, जो मैंने आपसे पहले विचार किया था, कि ये सांस्कृतिक विनाश को रोकना, ये भी भारत के लिए परम आवश्यक है, क्योंकि ये संस्कृति भारत की संस्कृति का ही विस्तार है। और वहाँ से हमें अभी बहुत कुछ लेना है। जो यहाँ से गया था वो सुरक्षित रखा है उन्होंने। हमें तिब्बत और उन देशों के प्रति बहुत आभार प्रकट करना चाहिए जिन्होंने हमारी उस सांस्कृतिक विरासत को बचा के रखा है, संजो के रखा है, और जिसको आज हम फिर वहाँ से प्राप्त कर सकते हैं, बशर्ते कि वो बची रहे। अगर तिब्बत के विश्वविद्यालय नष्ट हो गए, मोनेस्ट्रीज नष्ट हो गई, तो ये सारा भंडार नष्ट हो जाएगा। तो हमें तो इस बारे में चिंता करनी ही होगी कि ये सारा जो ज्ञान का भंडार है, संस्कृति का भंडार है, ये सुरक्षित रहे, ये बचा रहे। और इसके लिए हमें हमेशा प्रयत्नशील होना चाहिए, और तिब्बत तथा उन देशों के प्रति जिन्होंने इस खजाने को बचा के रखा है, हमारा आभार होना चाहिए, उनके प्रति हम कृतज्ञ होने चाहिए। दूसरी, कुछ इसके लिए अगर आवश्यक कदम उठाए जाने चाहें तो लासा में भारतीय कौंसलेट खुलवाने के लिए कोशिश की जाए, ताकि वहाँ से हम बहुत कुछ चीज़ें सुरक्षित करवा सकें, देख सकें क्या ये संभव है, क्या इस बात के लिए प्रयत्नशील होना उचित होगा, जिससे कि हम कम से कम भारत की उपस्थिति वहाँ दर्ज करा सकें। एक बात और तो मैं कहना चाहूँगा कि जैसा कि परम पूज्य दलाई लामा ने कहा है कि उन्होंने एक जिन्युइन ऑटोनॉमी की बात कही है, यथार्थ में जो सच्ची और यथार्थ की स्वायत्तता हो, केवल कागजी नहीं, वो तिब्बत को मिलनी चाहिए। और उन्होंने उसको चीन के सिस्टम के अंतर्गत ये मिले और चीन को एक शांति का क्षेत्र घोषित किया जाए, इस प्रकार के सुझाव दिए हैं। इन सुझावों पर गहराई से विचार होना चाहिए, क्योंकि इसके द्वारा मार्ग निकल सकते हैं, इसके द्वारा रास्ते निकल सकते हैं। इन 100 सालों में एक बात और हुई है, और वो ये हुई है कि जो किसी समय भारत और तिब्बत के बीच में सीमा हुआ करती थी, अब उसे भारत और चीन के बीच में सीमा कहा जाने लगा है। ये बड़ा भारी परिवर्तन हो गया है। इस परिवर्तन में हमारा क्या योगदान रहा है या हमारी क्या दुर्बलता रही है, इस पर भी हमें विचार करना चाहिए कि इन 100 सालों में ऐसा क्या हो गया कि जो तिब्बत और भारत के बीच की सीमा थी, वो इन 100 सालों में अब तिब्बत और चीन के बीच में सीमा आ गई है। ये एक ऐसा सवाल है जो भारत को विशेष रूप में इस पर चिंतन, मनन और कुछ समाधान का रास्ता खोजना चाहिए, क्योंकि दुनिया में जो परिवर्तन हुए हैं उनका मैंने संक्षेप में उल्लेख किया ही, विस्तार से भी हो सकता है, लेकिन हमारे अपने अस्तित्व को और हमारी अपनी पूरी जियो स्ट्रेटजी को, जिसको आजकल भू रणनीति या भू कूटनीति कहते हैं, उसको प्रभावित करने वाला ये एक बहुत बड़ा परिवर्तन हुआ है, जिसको एक भारतवासी के नाते हमें विचार करना चाहिए कि क्या ये शुभ है या अशुभ है। केवल हमारे लिए नहीं, परंतु इसके परिणाम एशिया के लिए और विश्व की शांति के लिए क्या होंगे, ये मैं समझता हूँ आज का सेमिनार इन सब बातों पर गहराई से विचार करेगा और कोई एक मार्ग सुझाने के लिए आप लोग अपने मंथन में से कुछ रत्न निकालेंगे। इन शब्दों के साथ मैं इस आज के सेमिनार को उद्घाटन करने का कर्तव्य पालन करता हूँ और साथ ही साथ आपकी इस आयोजन के लिए सफलता और शुभकामनाएं देता हूँ और ये विश्वास करता हूँ कि ये आपकी पॉलिसी फाउंडेशन इस प्रकार के कार्यक्रम आयोजित करती रहेगी और केवल दिल्ली में ही नहीं, परंतु देश के अन्य भागों में भी इस प्रकार की गोष्ठियों का आयोजन होना चाहिए, ताकि एक व्यापक पैमाने पर जन जागरण और चिंतन हो सके। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। नमस्कार।
Thank you, sir. I'd next like to call upon the next speaker. And if I may, take a little time to introduce him properly to you. Professor Michael van Walt van Praag is Professor of International Relations and International Law at Princeton at the Institute for Advanced Studies. He has written widely on Tibet and the Tibetan issue for over the many years. And today we look forward to hearing from him on the topic, which is slightly different from the topic that you see in your programs, which is the Simla agreements in international law. I was curious because it's in the plural, and I look forward, as I'm sure all of you are, to hearing him speak. Professor Van Walt.
So I'm extremely happy to be back in Delhi, seeing friends and meeting new acquaintances, but I'm particularly honored to be sharing this podium with such distinguished individuals as yourselves. Much has been written and said about the Simla conference, and surprisingly there is fairly little controversy over what actually occurred during the conference, and this is an account of the extensive documentation that's available about about what occurred in Simla and Delhi at the time. But despite that, the analyses of the outcomes of the Simla conference have yielded both various opinions and confusion, and 100 years later are still a source of conflict, as the situation in Tibet shows us, and of course also the continuing tensions over the border between India and China. Today I'll address the outcome of the conference, but more in particular do this in terms of the international legal validity of the three bilateral agreements that were concluded there. And here I'll present a summary of forms of political organization and of inter-polity relations by European ones that were based on the concept of exclusive territorial sovereignty and international law that provided a backdrop to this period. Changes which in fact had already been affecting relations between Tibet, British India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, and the Manchu-ruled Qing Empire, at least since the 19th century, if not earlier. We do well to remember, I think, in this context, that the Qing Empire was not China. The empire was established by the Manchus by means of conquest and subjugation of various Asian polities, China being one of them. The Mongols and the Chinese were ruled separately through discrete systems of administration on the basis of different principles and using different logics, languages, rituals, and symbols. The Manchus formed allegiance with the Mongol Khans while subjugating other Mongols and instituting various forms of overlordship, mostly indirect rule over them. In contrast, the relationship between the Manchus and the Chinese part of the empire was one of conqueror and conquered, so that China was ruled directly by the emperor using the traditional Chinese system of territorial administration to do so. The relationship of the Manchu emperors that they developed with the leaders of the Tibetan Buddhist civilizational world, and in particular with the Dalai Lamas of Tibet, was again entirely different. Unlike the Manchu relationships with the Chinese and Mongol elites, this was not established by conquest or military alliance, but was a complex religio-political one, founded at least in important part on the relationship between the spiritual teacher and his benefactor or protector, called the Choyun relationship. When the nationalist revolutionaries in China toppled the Qing imperial regime, the empire, of course, ceased to exist, as did the relationships that that empire had established that we just discussed. And Mongol leaders, as well as the Tibetan's Dalai Lama, proceeded to reform their own polities along independent lines. All the polities that emerged from the demise of the Qing Empire, including China, strove to reconceive themselves to fit the modern international legal requirements of statehood, of sovereignty, of territory, of effective control, and so on, and to project their power as well as to communicate their claims accordingly. Chinese nationalist leaders set out to project a concept of China as a multiracial nation-state that included the vast inner Asian territories. They attempted to appropriate, transform, and reinterpret age-old relationships forged by the Manchu emperors into the modern language of state and sovereignty, claiming that these regions had for centuries been part of China. In Tibet, the 13th Dalai Lama expelled Qing officials and troops from the country and asserted his country's independence in communications with foreign leaders, in a treaty between Tibet and Mongolia, and by resolutely rejecting Chinese nationalist governments' attempts to persuade Tibet to join or accept the new Chinese Republic. The Dalai Lama, of course, also issued a proclamation to his own people in Tibet in which the independence of the Tibetan state was expounded upon. Now, the Chinese President Yuan Shikai had already publicly proclaimed Mongolia and Tibet to be integral parts of China in April 1912. Consequently, when armed clashes developed between the Chinese and Tibetan troops on the border area between Tibet and China, in Kham, on the eastern part of the Tibetan plateau, Tibetans became concerned that China would attempt to take the country by force. The Dalai Lama urged Britain to mediate between the two sides, to end the fighting, and to establish clear borders between the two countries. Britain was reluctant to play this role until they discovered in the summer of 1912 that the Chinese were making plans to invade Tibet. Fearing that a Chinese advance on Tibet would destroy the buffer that Tibet provided between British Indian Empire and the new Chinese Republic, the British government set about persuading and pressuring the leaders in Beijing to agree to a tripartite conference to end the Sino-Tibetan conflict and to resolve both the issues of states. As is customary in this kind of international negotiations, the credentials of each delegation were formally presented to the other delegations at the start of the conference for their examination, recognition, and acceptance. When the Tibetan plenipotentiary's credentials were recognized and accepted by Great Britain and by China, this had two effects under international law. The first was to stop, in other words, to prohibit those two governments from thereafter rejecting or questioning the treaty-making capacity of the Tibetan state and government, and the authority of its delegation to represent and bind that state. Secondly, a de jure recognition, albeit an implicit one, of that state's independence. And this analysis is actually supported by the preamble to the Simla Convention. Now, the second highly important outcome of the conference, which should be of importance to Tibetans and the Tibetan government and to the PRC in any dialogue process that may develop again, was the ample evidence that the Simla Conference brought to light of the integrity of the Tibetan polity, included by the three delegations, was the border between Tibet and China. Both countries claimed most of Kham and Amdo, Qinghai in Chinese. When asked to substantiate their respective claims to these areas by the conference president, the Chinese delegate was in fact unable to do so. He based his claim solely on a narrative of Tibet having been a part of the Chinese territory since its alleged annexation by the Qing emperor in the 18th century. On the other hand, brought a large number, around 90, largely original documents to the meeting that showed centuries of religious and administrative, institution and political connections of nationhood and statehood, and neither its status nor its boundaries had been defined in modern political and legal terms. Instead of the centrality of determined boundaries with China, there were borderlands characterized by overlapping sources of authority, open zones, and autonomous polities with various degrees of connections and different kinds of connections to Lhasa. Institutional systems as it did through lay administrative institutions. These, the evidence brought to Simla, showed that they were both present in different ways throughout Kham and most of Amdo. And this evidence persuaded the British head of the delegation, Sir Henry McMahon, who was the president of that conference, to recognize in the draft Simla Agreement the territorial integrity of Tibet as a whole country, and even the division of Tibet into an outer and an inner region as proposed in the draft Simla Convention was not under the terms of that convention intended to affect the territorial integrity of the whole of Tibet. And in actual fact, of course, since China refused to sign the agreement, this division of Tibet into inner and outer Tibet was never effectuated. Account of where the border delimitation was being proposed between Tibet and China, Great Britain and Tibet concluded 3 bilateral agreements in Simla. The first agreement concerned the border between Tibet and British India to the east of Bhutan and was drawn up in the form of an exchange of notes between the two governments and a map showing the agreed border, signed and sealed by the plenipotentiaries. And of course, this border came to be known as. Moreover, the British would not change or interfere in the Tibetan administration of the territory and the collection of taxes and other revenues from there. Thus, in effect, what Tibet was agreeing to was a form of shared rule in exchange for the surrender of Tibetan ownership. Second bilateral agreement was a joint declaration signed on this day 100 years ago, to which the text of the Simla Convention was attached. And that joint declaration stated that the Simla Convention, as attached, was binding on the governments of Great Britain and Tibet, and so long as the government of China would withhold its signature from it, that country would be debarred from the enjoyment of all privileges accruing from the treaty. Concretely, the effect was that until such time as China would sign the agreement, which of course it never did, neither China's suzerainty nor its demands that Tibet be recognized as part of the territory of China, nor also the creation of the so-called Inner Tibet and provisions for Chinese administration there were to be conceded. The agreement as it stood only bound Great Britain and Tibet to fulfill their obligations under the agreement and did not create, of course, any rights or obligations for China. The third bilateral agreement that was concluded was on trade, and this confirmed and enhanced some of Great Britain's trade privileges in Tibet and limited and its limited extraterritorial rights there. Now, none of the parties to the Simla negotiations actually achieved their original objectives, the most immediate being to bring an end to the conflict on the Sino-Tibetan border and durably settle that border. At the same time, both Great Britain and Tibet derived some important benefits from the outcome of the conference. The Chinese government, on their part, had sought recognition of China's sovereignty over Tibet, which it claimed to be an integral part of the new Chinese Republic. And by leaving the conference without any agreement, the Chinese government failed both to secure recognition of the borders it claimed and the acknowledgement that Tibet formed part of the territory of China, and the recognition of any suzerainty over so-called Outer Tibet, as well as the rights that it negotiated for itself in the eastern and northeastern portions of Tibet, described as Inner Tibet in the Convention. The Tibetan government gained from the conference the recognition of its international personality and its independent status, which the equal status at the conference and the bilateral agreements with Great Britain implied. It also benefited from the recognition in those bilateral agreements, but in particular in the Simla Convention itself, of the integrity of the whole of Tibet, encompassing most of the Tibetan plateau. The buffer state that Great Britain had hoped to secure to the north of British India was only partly fulfilled, since as long as no agreement was reached with China, Tibet continued to face a threat of a Chinese military attack and political manipulation. And the records of the India office in London reveal that the British government in London was in fact not pleased with the separate conclusion with Tibet of the border agreement and the joint declaration. And a fair amount has been written on this. This apprehension was in large part caused by the fear that Russia would accuse Britain of having violated provision of the Russo-British Agreement of 1907, which precluded either party from entering into treaties directly with Tibet and from acquiring territory from that country. The British government's worry was therefore particularly that Russia would feel free to disregard its own obligations from that same 1907 treaty, as that concerned Afghanistan and Persia in particular, and that this could damage British interests there. Finally, a word on the legal validity of the three bilateral treaties concluded at Simla. Treaties by any name are legally valid if they're concluded between states with the capacity to conclude treaties, and this is done by their duly empowered representatives. Under international law, various names can be used to describe treaties, such as protocols, covenants, conventions, agreements, exchanges of notes, and even joint declarations. The forms can also be many, so it can be a single document, signed, and in some cases ratified by the parties, and this can have the same effect as a formal exchange of notes between the governments. Some treaties enter into force upon signatures, others require a process of ratification, but this is determined by the terms of the treaty themselves. As far as the similar agreements are concerned, all three of them, they entered into force upon signature. In 1914, very few grounds existed for the invalidity of treaties, and none were present in respect to the treaties concluded between Great Britain and Tibet at Simla. Moreover, under the law in existence at that time, a treaty would only have been voidable if the treaty party damaged, by it had demanded its invalidation and the other party had agreed to it, or if the matter was resolved by a recognized dispute resolution mechanism such as an international tribunal. Unhappiness with the outcomes of negotiations, political machinations, or unhappiness about the behavior of the negotiators did not affect the validity nor the enforceability of treaties. Finally, evidence of the validity of the agreements concluded is also inferred from their invocation, implementation, and enforcement. Both the British and the successor Indian governments reaffirmed the validity of the agreements concluded at Simla on numerous occasions. Suffice it to mention here that when India achieved its independence in 1947, it assumed Great Britain's treaty obligations concerning relations with Tibet, including those that arose out of the Simla agreements. Shortly after independence, the Indian government expressly confirmed this position in a letter to the Tibetan Foreign Office. And once again, after some ill-advised ambiguity, it invoked their validity again years later after the Chinese invasion of Tibet in an official communication to the government of the People's Republic of China in 1959. This time, the government of India referred specifically to the equal status of Tibet at the negotiations in Simla, as evidenced by the recognition of the Tibetan plenipotentiary's credentials, both by Great Britain and China, and emphasizing that Tibet and the other parties at the conference had the full right to decide all matters that may be, and now I'm quoting, that may be beneficial to them. Although China, by not signing the Simla Convention, maintained its claims intact and kept its options to pursue its objectives by other means, and we know what those eventually were, it's important for Tibet and India to be clear and ambiguous, at least on this issue, that the agreements they signed at Simla 100 years ago were valid and enforceable under international law, and that this is and should still not be without consequences today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, tea is served.